So, when we're talking about risks with a table saw, what are the main things? If you're doing this course, and you've already done the Kickback course that we have, so that's obviously the very first one. Kickback is the big risk on table saws. A lot of people like to say amputation or cutting themselves is the risk, but that's really a consequence rather than a risk. People don't tend to pay so little attention that they pass a limb through the blade. Typically what happens is they have some kind of accident involving kickback, they lose control of the material, and their hand passes through the blade as a result. So kickback on a table saw is generated a few ways. There's really three main ways. The first way is that you have something thin and it climbs up over the blade and it kind of gets past this midpoint to the back here, and the saw, rather than cutting it, picks the material up and flings it forward. Sometimes when you have lumber that's dried or has a lot of tension in it and everything else, if you're cutting a nice long rip cut, the lumber can either spread out or close in and pinch on the blade. If it closes in and pinches on the blade picks it up, throws it. If you haven't put in a safety zone, so if you're doing that same rip cut and it warps away from the blade and you don't have a safety zone, which we'll talk about later in the course, it'll bind against the blade, get picked up, get thrown. So kickback is almost inevitable. Everyone has some minor form of it at one point or another. It's about mitigating the risk through setup and making sure that you're nowhere near the blade, so that even if it does happen, that you're not in the line of fire, your hands aren't too close, that sort of thing. And just understanding what triggers it so that you can try and preempt it. Other risks on the table saw, so trips, slips and falls. We always like you to have the blade below the table when the saw is not in use. It's quite possible for someone to be walking through the shop and trip and put their hand out to catch themselves, and we don't want them to put a hand on the blade, so keeping that below the surface of the table is always a good idea when the saw is not in use. Collisions are another issue with the table saw. So if you're making a cut and someone isn't paying attention and runs into your material, or you're using the sliding table and you haven't cleared the path correctly and you run into something, you can torque your material. The moment you torque your material, it might catch the blade and it might get thrown. So mitigating collisions is just about awareness of the environment and making sure that everything's set up correctly and notifying people around you of what you're doing. Another common one that is quite dangerous on these saws is blade damage. Blades can have chipped or damaged teeth on them, and they can throw those teeth when the saw starts up or when it hits something particularly hard. Chips and damage to the teeth typically happens when someone runs metal through the saw, like a nail or a bolt that's been left inside some reclaimed piece of timber or whatever else. We've definitely had it here. We get our blades serviced regularly and we see all the chipped blades and all the chipped teeth that happen. There's nothing you can really do to mitigate that aside from inspecting the blade before you use it. One of the things that we try and tell people to do is don't put your head in the path of the blade, particularly on startup. There's some sort of human instinct that makes people do that. We see it all the time. People will turn the saw on and they'll do this and put their head in the path of the blade just to make sure it's spinning. It's very weird. So try not to do that. The last issue we have is that the scribing blade on this saw is in front of the main blade. So we have the main blade here, and then right in front of the blade is the scribing blade. The scribing blade runs in the opposite direction to the main blade at all times. It doesn't turn on and off, it's always running. It's belt driven from the main blade. So we have the main blade running this way to make the cut, and we have the scribing blade running this way to cut the underside of the material. If you have your material here and you turn the saw on and the scribing blade's up just a little bit and you haven't noticed, it's going to pick that material up and throw it into the main blade, and you're probably not going to be ready for that, and it's going to throw it somewhere else. So whenever you start a cut, we always ask you to start back here before the blade plate, which is this black piece of metal here. The scribing blade, because it's so low and because it only ever comes up above the table surface less than a millimeter, it's going to be invisible in normal operation because there's just not enough of it to see. So just be very aware that the scribing blade's there on this saw, and be careful around making sure that it's out of the way, or it's engaged when you expect it to be engaged.